A child is born in poverty, rises to become one of the most successful generals of all time, and then goes on to conquer much of Europe. But then he loses his empire in a single year. This is the story of Napoleon. Napoleon was born on August 15, 1769. He was born on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, which had recently been seized by the Republic of Pisa from the Republic of Genoa. Although it wasn't really an island at the time. It was more like a semi-island because a small isthmus connected it to mainland Italy. Napoleon would spend his childhood looking across the narrow channel of water that separated him from the Italian mainland. And it was this stretch of sea that Napoleon said was the cradle of his ambition. By the time Napoleon was 10, his father had made enough money back in his home village to send him off to military school on mainland France. In order to get into the school, Napoleon had to pretend that he was French, when in reality he spoke little French and instead spoke Corsican. In fact, there are claims that Napoleon actually didn't know any French at all when he first arrived at the school. But anyway, after a few years at the military school, Napoleon was sent to Paris to complete his education and become an artillery officer. In 1785, while Napoleon was still finishing his studies, he met a woman named Josephine de Beauharnais, who was also studying but in a different school for women. They married in 1787, and their relationship would be one of the defining relationships of Napoleon's life, even though they would eventually get divorced. As we now know, Napoleon was Corsican, and it seems that he was proud of his heritage. But after he got married, he started going by the name Napoleon Bonaparte, dropping the I from Corsican. Why? Because he realized that people with Italian-sounding names were often viewed with suspicion in France, and so he changed his name to sound less Italian. At the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, Napoleon was a young artillery officer. He saw the revolution as an opportunity for advancement. And during the early days of the revolution, he switched sides several times, supporting whichever side seemed like it was going to win. For example, in 1793, he helped defend the city of Paris against an invasion by a revolutionary army. And yet, just 2 months later, he joined the revolutionary side. Napoleon supported whoever was in power partly because he was a pragmatist, but also because he was ambitious and wanted to climb the political ladder. Initially, he rose through the ranks of the army because of his competence as an artillery officer, but once he was high enough up on the ladder, he could also use his position to make himself even more powerful. For example, in 1795, he orchestrated a coup d'état that overthrew the government of the French Riviera and established a new government friendly to the revolution. Then, in 1796, he was given command of the French army in Italy, and it was here that Napoleon started to really make a name for himself. He won several battles against the Austrians, including the Battle of Lodi, where he crossed the River Adda with his troops, stormed a bridge, and then blew up the bridge behind them with barrels of gunpowder so that the Austrians could uncross the river and pursue them. This and other victories gained him great fame, and upon returning to Paris, he was greeted as a hero. Soon after, he was promoted to become commander-in-chief of all the French armies, putting him in charge of the war effort against the Austrians, Prussians, British, Dutch, and other European nations that were fighting against the French. It was at this point that Napoleon began to develop his grand plan to defeat the coalitions that were formed against France. His first step was to finish off the Austrians once and for all. To do so, he invaded northern Italy and defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. After this victory, he began implementing his larger strategy by invading northern Italy again and decisively defeating the Austrians at the Battle of Caron Sabres. With Austria out of the way, Napoleon turned his attention to the other European powers and began a series of brilliant military campaigns that resulted in victories at the battles of Fleurus, Fribourg, Hohenlinden, among others. After defeating the coalition, Napoleon was ready to take his next step, conquering and reorganizing Europe according to his ideals. During the peace negotiations, he had secretly decided to invade and conquer Egypt. The Egyptian campaign was unsuccessful, but it did produce some important scientific discoveries, such as the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Anyway, soon after returning from Egypt, Napoleon became first consul, essentially making him the leader of France. At this point, he ruled as a dictator, even though France was technically still a republic. Napoleon was both feared and respected by his contemporaries, and even his enemies admired his talent and brilliance. He was loved by many in France because he brought stability to the country after the chaos of the French Revolution. He reformed the legal system, reorganized local governments, improved schools, and created a merit-based system for the army. Perhaps his greatest accomplishment as first consul was negotiating the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria. This treaty ended the war with Austria and gave France territorial gains, notably the region of Venice. But perhaps even more importantly, the treaty bound Austria and France together in an alliance. Napoleon then went on to conquer northern Italy, taking down remaining Austrian forces in the process and forcing the rest of Europe to form another anti-French coalition. But Napoleon defeated them decisively at the Battle of Marengo, proving himself to be virtually invincible on the battlefield. After further reforms, including the introduction of the Napoleonic Code, a legal code that emphasized equality before the law, freedom of religion, and other liberal ideas, Napoleon's popularity in France soared. And in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. And this is when Napoleon's downfall began. You see, despite being popular in France, many Europeans saw Napoleon as a threat to their way of life. So they formed the Third Coalition against him. But Napoleon defeated them handily, crushing the coalition, and adding the Dutch Republic, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Cisalpine Republic to his growing empire. But his victories in Europe came at a cost. His empire was stretched too thin, and wars can be expensive. And the cost of the war was beginning to wear on the French people. But Napoleon had an idea to pay for his wars. He would raise taxes on the peasants. Now, obviously, this was not popular among the peasants, but Napoleon was able to get away with it because of how popular he was. But the problem was that Napoleon was starting to alienate other members of the elite class. The tax increases offended the wealthy, and they started talking about overthrowing Napoleon and replacing him with someone more favorable to them. And this was dangerous because if the elites turned against him, his popularity might start to wane. And without the support of the public, Napoleon would be in trouble. So Napoleon tried to placate the elites by ending his first marriage and marrying Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. But this only made him more unpopular with the general public. And this is when things started to turn against him. The Spanish people rebelled against their king, Ferdinand VII, whom they saw as a puppet of Napoleon. Napoleon sent troops to put down the rebellion, but they were unsuccessful. In fact, the Spanish people continued to fight back against the French and their allies, turning the Iberian Peninsula into a quagmire. It was at this point that Napoleon made a crucial mistake. He decided to invade Russia. He had previously attempted to pressure the Russians into submission by invading and conquering their ally, the Duchy of Warsaw. But this failed to break the Russians, and they stayed in the coalition against him. So he decided to go to war. Napoleon assembled the largest army in history and marched on Moscow. But after suffering huge losses due to disease and starvation, he was forced to retreat. When his army retreated back across the Dnieper River, the Russians blew up the bridges behind them, trapping Napoleon's army in Russia. Those who didn't die of starvation or exposure slowly made their way back to France. While Napoleon was gone, the Swedish, Norwegians, British, and Dutch invaded his territories and started to roll back his conquests. Soon after Napoleon returned to France, he abdicated the throne and was exiled to the island of Elba. But he escaped just a few months later and returned to Paris. But by this point, his popularity was completely gone. And when he entered Paris, people threw rocks at him. The French people were sick of war and didn't want him to lead them anymore. The rest of Europe also saw this as an opportunity to finally get rid of Napoleon once and for all. And so the French elites switched sides and allied themselves with the rest of Europe. Napoleon gathered what soldiers he could and fought against the coalition. But he was decisively defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he spent the last 6 years of his life writing his memoirs. He died on May 5, 1821. Napoleon may have had humble beginnings, but his impact on European history was colossal. He spread the ideals of the French Revolution throughout Europe. He introduced many liberal reforms into France. And whether you love him or hate him, there's no denying that he was one of the most brilliant military strategists of all time. What do you think? Was Napoleon a hero or a villain? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.